The most life-changing moment of my career wasn't signing a billion-dollar deal or standing on stage as a celebrated CEO. It was when a little girl I had never seen before walked up to me, looked straight into my eyes, and whispered, "Will you be my mom?" 5 simple words that shattered everything I thought I knew about success, power, and even myself. I had conquered boardrooms, survived takeovers, and silenced critics. But nothing prepared me for this one question, and the answer I gave changed both of our lives forever. In a sea of voices, one tiny question shattered everything I believed about success. Power, as I had always known it, didn't come from presence or personality, it came from performance. I had spent my entire adult life mastering that. Every step I took was measured. Every word I spoke was intentional. I had become the kind of CEO whose name alone could open doors, whose opinion could shift markets, and whose silence could silence a room. I wasn't warm, and I certainly wasn't soft, but I was respected, feared, and, by most definitions, successful. That evening was just another function in the long line of functions I'd stopped caring about long ago. A black tie charity gala under the banner of one of our biggest corporate partnerships. The event promised to raise millions for underprivileged youth, a phrase so worn out it had become corporate wallpaper. My presence was both strategic and expected. I wasn't there to connect with the cause. I was there to protect the brand, to smile when needed, to speak when scripted, and to let the cameras capture the illusion of compassion without ever needing to feel it. The ballroom was what you'd expect: polished marble, chandeliers that dripped crystal, and air perfumed with ego and entitlement. Champagne flowed like water, and laughter hovered just above sincerity. My team hovered nearby like a choreographed shadow, keeping my schedule on track down to the second. I delivered my speech with calculated grace. It was perfectly paced, emotionally balanced, and subtly boastful. The audience responded exactly as rehearsed: nods, smiles, curated applause. Another win. Another night of pretending to care. I stepped off the stage into a crowd of waiting hands and compliments, ready to let the night fade into the blur of all the other ones just like it. And then, out of nowhere, she appeared. She was small, so small that at first, I barely noticed her. She weaved through the towering legs of gala guests like a ripple moving through glass. Her dress was faded and wrinkled, hanging loosely off one shoulder, and her hair was an unruly mass of curls that looked untouched by comfort or care. She held a stuffed animal by the neck, a bear that had clearly survived years of love and loss. There was no adult with her, no escort, no visible purpose. She just walked straight toward me, stepped into the spotlight of my carefully maintained world, and looked directly into my eyes. And then she said it. "Will you be my mom?" The words were so simple, so impossibly quiet, yet they cracked through the noise of the room like thunder in a cathedral. I froze, not physically, but internally. Something in me flinched. Something I hadn't felt in years stirred. Something I didn't recognize anymore. Her voice wasn't performative. It wasn't rehearsed. It was as pure and direct as breath. There was no manipulation in her face. No fear. No sense of danger or expectation. Just hope, raw, delicate, and unbelievably disarming. I blinked. I wanted to say something. Anything. But for the first time in a very long time, I had no script to follow. No one else noticed. My assistant stood behind me, nodding at someone across the room, waiting for the next handshake. The music played on. Cameras flashed. Nothing about the world stopped except me. I knelt, my knees locking with a quiet ache I hadn't noticed until then. I was eye level with her now. Her skin was pale beneath the ballroom lights, and her cheeks were flushed from cold or nerves I couldn't tell. She smelled like city rain and something old, like forgotten fabric or basements. Her eyes were impossibly dark, too serious for someone so young. "What's your name?" I asked, finally finding my voice. She didn't answer. Instead, she repeated the same question, softer this time. Will you be my mom? I felt it, then a tremor deep inside me, like the echo of a wound I had refused to acknowledge. I didn't know this child. I had never seen her before. And yet, the way she looked at me felt devastatingly familiar, as though she were peering into some version of myself I had spent a lifetime burying. Before I could respond, someone from my team touched my shoulder and leaned in. "Photos in 2 minutes, ma'am." I nodded, distracted. When I turned back, the girl was gone. Just like that. No trace. No sound. One moment she was there, and the next, she wasn't. I rose slowly to my feet and scanned the room, heart pounding with something dangerously close to panic. But there was nothing. No one else had seen her. No one was looking for her. The crowd flowed around me like I was a rock in a river, unmoved and unimportant. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed in bed, stripped out of my dress, scrubbed off my makeup, but I couldn't wash away her voice. It wasn't just the question. It was the way she asked it, as though she had already decided I was the answer. She didn't need proof or background or explanation. She needed one word, one decision, and for the first time in decades, I wasn't sure I had it in me. I stared at the ceiling and thought of my own childhood. I remembered the endless wait for a mother who was too tired, too busy, too disappointed to look me in the eye. I remembered standing in the doorway of her bedroom with a crayon drawing in my hand, waiting to be noticed, waiting to be enough. I remembered learning, over time, that being wanted was a rare, dangerous thing, and that asking for it always led to disappointment. But she had asked, and somehow, she had asked me. The next morning, I reviewed the event footage myself. I wanted to prove she was real, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing in some wine-softened dream, but she wasn't in the official photographs, not in the video clips either. There were no security reports. No guests mentioned her. It was as if she had slipped in and out of existence for only that single moment, just long enough to say what she needed to say. But I knew she was real. I had felt her hand brush against my wrist when I leaned down. I had seen the truth in her eyes, and that kind of truth doesn't come from ghosts. All day, I carried her question like a secret I didn't know how to protect. I canceled meetings. I ignored emails. The usual metrics, profit graphs, stakeholder notes, partnership briefs suddenly felt lifeless, because none of it could explain why I couldn't stop hearing her voice in my head. "Will you be my mom?" 5 words that rewrote everything I thought I knew about myself. I had spent a lifetime perfecting distance. I didn't do emotions. I didn't do attachments. And I certainly didn't do motherhood. But for the first time, I wanted to. I smiled politely, but something inside me broke, and I didn't even know why. I had walls built taller than skyscrapers, and she walked right through them. I tried to shake it off. That's what I told myself in the car on the way home, watching the city roll past the tinted windows like it didn't just happen. I adjusted my posture, uncrossed and recrossed my legs, scrolled through meaningless notifications on my phone, all the rituals I performed when something unsettled me. But nothing worked. Her voice still echoed in my ears. That question, as soft as breath but heavier than any boardroom decision I had ever made. Will you be my mom? I had convinced myself long ago that I didn't react to emotions, not in public, not in private, not even internally. I had trained myself to rise above sentiment, to step around pain like a puddle on the street. But the way she looked at me, those eyes didn't just register in my memory. They lodged themselves into something deeper. They weren't ordinary eyes. They were eyes that asked and accused at the same time. They carried questions without words. Not the kind of questions people ask out loud, but the kind they whisper to themselves in the dark. Are you the one? Will you stay? Will you leave like the rest? And somehow, I had known those eyes. Not hers exactly, but what lived inside them. They reminded me of a version of myself I had long since buried. A girl who sat at the edge of her bed every night listening to the silence outside her room, hoping for footsteps, a knock, a voice that never came. A girl who worked twice as hard as everyone else because love was something to be earned, never freely given. A girl who stopped asking questions when she learned that answers only ever brought disappointment. The car pulled up to my building, and I stepped out onto polished stone, greeted by the usual doorman and the cold silence of a life built without interruption. My penthouse was pristine, immaculate, designed for function, not warmth. No photos on the walls, no toys in the corners, no evidence of life beyond me. I walked through the living room, heels clicking like echoes in an empty museum, and sank into the leather couch, finally letting the silence speak. She had seen through me. That little girl, whoever she was, had looked past the designer dress, past the name on the event banner, past the forced applause. She had looked directly at the woman behind it all and asked for something real, something terrifying, something I didn't know I was missing until she said it. "Will you be my mom?" It haunted me, not just the words, the simplicity, the clarity, the certainty. I poured myself a glass of wine, though it tasted dull. I scrolled through photos from the event, images I usually approved for press use, but this time I wasn't looking for angles or lighting. I was looking for her. Frame after frame, donor after donor, plastic smile after plastic smile, but she wasn't there. It was like she had never existed, and yet, she had changed everything. I closed my laptop and stared at the dark screen until my own reflection began to blur. I saw the lines around my eyes, the tight set of my mouth, the exhaustion I could never quite outrun. I thought about what I had traded to get here. The holidays spent alone, the relationships abandoned in the name of ambition, the child I had once been frightened, desperate for affection, and slowly transforming into the very woman she was now staring at on the other side of the glass. I remembered a night from when I was about 7, the same age as that girl, maybe. I had won a spelling bee at school and come home with a certificate in one hand and trembling excitement in the other. My mother barely glanced at it. "Don't let it go to your head," she said. "One win doesn't mean you're special." I nodded, pretending I agreed, and went to my room without a word. That night, I cried into my pillow, silently, so no one would hear, and I promised myself I would never need praise again. I would become so successful that no one would ever have to love me for free. They would respect me instead, fear me, admire me from afar. That girl's eyes broke that promise in seconds, because for a split second, I felt the old ache return, the part of me that had wanted to be loved without having to earn it. The part that wanted to be chosen. At the office the next morning, I tried to return to routine. I reviewed contracts, nodded through presentations, offered brief approval on expansion proposals. But my mind wasn't there. I couldn't stop seeing her, those eyes, that question. It wasn't just a child's plea. It was a mirror, a quiet confrontation of everything I had refused to confront in myself. I could lie to my staff. I could lie to the media, but I couldn't lie to her, and now I couldn't lie to myself either. I opened a blank tab on my computer and began searching children's shelters, missing persons reports, event guest lists. I didn't even know where to begin, but something inside me refused to let it go. There were thousands of children in this city who needed help, but this wasn't about charity anymore. This was about her, that one girl. The one who had found the smallest crack in my armor and walked straight through it like she'd known the way her whole life. By noon, I shut my office door and sat in the dark, eyes closed. I remembered her silence after the question, the way she didn't try to explain herself or justify anything. She had simply asked and waited, as though she understood that real questions didn't need convincing. They either landed or they didn't, and I had let her walk away. I told myself I didn't even know her name. I told myself she probably had a family. I told myself she might have been joking, but I didn't believe any of it. because I knew those eyes. I knew what it meant to ask for love without asking for pity, and I knew what it meant to be denied. That evening, I found myself walking through the city streets long after sunset, wrapped in a coat that cost more than most families spent in a month, searching faces I didn't recognize for the one I couldn't forget. My assistant called, confused by my absence. I said I needed air, but the truth was, I needed her. Not to save her, not to redeem myself. I needed her because, somehow, in those few seconds, she had become the only honest thing in a life built on illusion. Just when I thought I could dismiss her, I found myself searching for her. She vanished without a trace, but her question kept echoing like a scream. I've dealt with vanishing people before, executives who disappear when a company collapses, clients who vanish when debts come due, and even family members who slowly recede into silence when your success becomes inconvenient. But this was different. She didn't vanish out of guilt or fear. She vanished like smoke, like something not made to stay. And yet, the question she left behind lingered in my mind louder than any boardroom confrontation ever had. The next morning, I tried to dive into my routine, forcing myself into the usual rituals that gave me the illusion of stability. I reviewed analytics, took calls from investors, offered my opinion on mergers, and nodded at things I didn't care about. But I couldn't focus. Every graph blurred. Every voice sounded distant. Because underneath the surface of my perfect professional life was that question, will you be my mom? Looping endlessly in the back of my consciousness, like a song I couldn't stop hearing. I called Kara, my assistant, into my office. She walked in with her usual confidence, expecting directives about schedules or strategy, but I didn't ask for a meeting reschedule or a data set. I asked her to help me find a little girl. Her eyebrows rose slightly. From the event? I nodded. She approached me, about 6 or 7, curly hair, old dress, holding a teddy bear. Was she with anyone? No, I said, and then hesitated. At least, I don't think so. Kara didn't question me further. She only said, I'll start with the charity organizers. By that afternoon, we had checked the guest lists, the volunteer rosters, and the media galleries. No one had her name. There were no children matching my description on the official documentation. She hadn't been registered through the event. She wasn't in any of the footage. It was like she had never been there at all. But I knew better. I had seen her. I had heard her. I could still feel the spot on my wrist where her fingers briefly touched mine. She was real, and if no one could tell me who she was, I would find her myself. I canceled everything for the next 2 days. No interviews, no board meetings, no product launches. The team was confused, maybe even panicked. CEOs don't disappear without explanation. But I didn't care. Not this time. Kara and I expanded our search. We called every shelter within a 10-mile radius. Most had records of families. Some even had childcare programs, but none matched the girl I described. We checked with social workers. Nothing. We looked through city databases, CPS files, missing child bulletins. Still nothing. She wasn't in the system. That's when I realized something terrifying. She had likely never been in the system at all. No paperwork. No trail. Just a child drifting through the cracks in a city too large to notice. We began canvassing local areas that didn't show up on official maps. I dressed down in plain clothes and walked block after block. I visited shelters personally, asking staff if they recognized her. I carried a sketch, an artist's rendering based on my memory, printed in color and pinned to my clipboard. I showed it to street vendors, subway guards, community center volunteers. Most people shook their heads. Some looked at me with pity. Others were too busy surviving to care. And then, on the 3rd day, I found a thread. A man running a food cart on the corner of 9th and Grand recognized the drawing. He told me she'd come by a few nights ago, alone, asking if he had anything left after closing. When he gave her a sandwich, she broke it in half and gave the bigger piece to a much smaller child, a boy, maybe 3 years old, skinny and quiet. "She didn't eat first," he said. "Just made sure the boy was fed." I asked where she went. He pointed toward an alley 2 blocks over, where a rundown shelter had closed its doors last winter, but was still occasionally used by squatters. I went there without hesitation. The streets narrowed as I moved deeper into the district. The buildings looked hollow, their windows boarded or broken, trash collected in heaps, and the smell was something between gasoline and mold. My shoes stuck slightly to the pavement with each step, but I kept going. I was no longer a CEO walking through a slum. I was a woman following the ghost of a child. Near the back wall of a collapsed structure, I saw a flicker of yellow fabric. She was sitting on the ground, her back against the wall, the same stuffed bear in her lap. Her hair was tied in a loose knot with a shoelace. Her knees were drawn up to her chest, and beside her, leaning sleepily against her side, was the boy, the toddler the vendor had mentioned. He looked too thin, his cheeks hollow, but he clung to her as if he belonged nowhere else. She saw me, immediately. There was no surprise in her face, no fear, just a long, slow blink, like she had expected me eventually. I walked forward, slowly, heart beating with an urgency I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know what I would say, only that I had to say something. "I've been looking for you," I said gently. She said nothing. She simply tightened her arm around the little boy's shoulder and shifted her body between him and me ever so slightly, like a shield. "I'm not here to take him," I said. "Or you." Still, she didn't speak. She looked at me the way she had that night, directly, bravely, like she was calculating whether I was worth another risk. I crouched a few feet away and met her eyes. "I don't even know your name," I whispered. She looked down, fingers stroking the torn ear of her bear. "Can you tell me?" I asked. "Or, can I help?" She blinked again. And then, quietly, she said, "Don't tell him I asked." "Asked what?" She stared at me. "About being my mom." My chest tightened. "Why?" "Because he needs me to be strong." She wasn't talking about herself. She was talking about the boy. I didn't know what to say to that. How could I? I had spent a lifetime running from needing anyone, and here she was, a child, choosing strength over survival for the sake of someone smaller. I heard footsteps behind the wall. The girl's eyes shifted slightly. She whispered, "Don't let him see you." "Who?" I asked, but I already knew. A man staggered around the corner, middle-aged, unshaven, clearly intoxicated. His shirt was stained, pants torn, and a plastic bottle dangled from his hand. He didn't see me. He looked only at her and barked something I couldn't make out. She flinched. The boy startled. She stood quickly, positioning herself between the man and the boy. "Get over here," the man growled. She looked back at me, not with fear but with defeat. And then I saw who she was walking back to, and my heart sank. Her home wasn't broken, it was barely surviving. I followed her with caution, my steps light against the warped wooden floors of the deteriorating stairwell, my heart thudding louder than I would admit. She didn't once glance back to check if I was near, didn't call out, didn't seem to fear my presence. She walked with a quiet kind of resolve. The toddler's hand held firmly in hers as if she were the only thing tethering him to any form of safety. She moved with a confidence that didn't belong to a child, the kind that comes from doing what you've had no choice but to learn. Far too young. The building they entered looked more like a condemned shell than a place anyone would call home. Its outer facade was chipped and discolored, the kind of building people forget to report because they've forgotten the people inside it, too. A rusted gate creaked open to a narrow corridor, the air thick with the smell of mildew, stale air, and something faintly metallic. Broken mailboxes lined the walls like open mouths, and the sound of television static echoed faintly from one of the upper units, like the ghost of a family pretending everything was still normal. I stayed a few steps behind as she climbed the stairs. Her feet didn't drag. She wasn't tired, or if she was, she'd learned not to show it. At the second floor, she pushed open a door with no number, the paint long since chipped away, the frame barely holding it upright. She stepped inside with the toddler, who now clung to the back of her shirt. She didn't close the door behind her. That detail, small and quiet, settled in my chest like a stone. It wasn't just carelessness. It was invitation, or maybe resignation, a sign that privacy wasn't something she expected anymore. I stood just outside the threshold for a moment, unsure if I had the right to cross it. Then I stepped inside slowly, careful not to speak too soon, not to disrupt whatever fragile rhythm kept this space from collapsing completely. The room smelled like damp wood and forgotten time. A sagging couch sat in the middle, covered with an assortment of blankets and clothing, some clean, most not. In the corner, I saw two more children, one barely walking, the other still crawling, fiddling with empty plastic containers and a cracked phone case as if they were treasured toys. The walls bore faded marks from drawings, stickers, and damage that had never been repaired. The light bulb above flickered once, then gave up entirely, casting the room in a heavy amber dimness. And then, in the far corner, I saw her, the woman who might have once been something more than what she had now become. She lay still in a narrow bed, pushed against the wall, her skin gray beneath the shallow rise and fall of her chest, her hair flattened across a pillow that hadn't been changed in weeks. Her eyes twitched in restless sleep, or perhaps in pain. But she didn't open them. She didn't move at all. The little girl walked over to her and adjusted the thin blanket, pressing her palm to the woman's forehead with the kind of tenderness you rarely see in adults, let alone children. The toddler stood beside her, holding the hem of her dress like an anchor. She said something softly to him, something only he was meant to hear. He nodded, though I wasn't sure he even understood. She had clearly become more than a sister. She was his everything. I stepped forward, and only then did she notice me. She didn't flinch or act surprised. She just turned her face toward me and watched, as if waiting to see what I would do next. There was no fear in her expression, just weariness, and something sharper beneath it. Something protective. Something I recognized. I asked gently, "Is this where you live?" She nodded, her gaze steady. "With all of them?" Another nod. "And her?" I motioned toward the woman in the bed. "She's sick," she replied. "She's been sick a long time." The way she said it made it sound like a fact, not a tragedy like she'd had to explain it too many times before. "Is she your mom?" She shook her head. "She lets us stay here." My stomach twisted. She didn't say, "She takes care of us," or even, "She loves us." Just that they were allowed to exist in the same room, that was all. I asked about the man from earlier, the one I'd seen stumble away. Her eyes narrowed, just slightly. She didn't answer. That silence told me everything I needed to know and more than I wanted to imagine. I reached into my purse and pulled out my card. It was all I had in the moment, a meaningless piece of plastic that bore my name in expensive lettering and a phone number I usually reserved for people who had something to offer me. I extended it to her. "If you ever need something," I said, "call this." She didn't take it. She simply looked at it, then looked at me. And that was enough to let me know she wouldn't use it. I started to turn, away. But she stepped forward suddenly and slipped something into my coat pocket. I froze. By the time I reached in and unfolded the piece of paper, she had already gone back to the sick woman's bedside. The note was written in faint pencil on a torn piece of lined notebook paper. "Please don't forget me." The words hit harder than any confrontation I'd ever faced. They weren't begging. They weren't pleading. They were stating something as clear as truth. She already knew I might forget. She was asking me not to. I left quickly, my throat tight, the note folded in my hand like it had weight beyond its size. The stairwell groaned beneath my steps. The city felt different when I exited that building, louder somehow, but emptier. I looked at the people around me, going about their lives, and wondered how many of them had ever looked at a child and seen her the way I had. How many had ignored her, walked past her, failed her. Back in my apartment, I couldn't shake it. The silence didn't comfort me like it usually did. The walls of my home felt like a cage, and the pristine countertops, the expensive furniture, the untouched guest room, all of it suddenly felt hollow. I couldn't stop picturing that small apartment, the shadows on the wall, the sick woman barely breathing, and the girl who was raising 3 children with a kind of grace that didn't belong to someone so young. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing there again, not asking for anything, just watching me leave. I saw the paper in her hand. I felt the weight of her hope. That night, I sat up until morning light leaked through my windows, and I realized something I couldn't unfeel. I wasn't just haunted by what I'd seen. I was bound to it. I made a decision that night, one I couldn't take back. One act of kindness nearly cost me my empire. There is a strange moment when instinct takes over. Reason a flicker of clarity where you stop, calculating consequences, and instead act from a place you didn't even know still existed. That's what it felt like when I decided to take her home. I didn't consult my legal team. I didn't call a PR strategist or brainstorm with my board. I didn't even ask her if she wanted to come. I simply looked into her eyes and knew I couldn't walk away again. Whatever line existed between empathy and obligation had already been crossed the second she slipped that note into my pocket. I read it again that morning, and something shifted. I wasn't just haunted anymore. I was responsible. The decision wasn't heroic. It wasn't even wise. It was reckless, the kind of move that gets CEOs stripped of power and buried under scandals. But I made it anyway. Through private channels and legal favors I'd spent years earning, I arranged an emergency guardianship. It wasn't adoption, and it wasn't permanent, but it was enough to protect her, at least temporarily. I made the calls, signed the paperwork, and within 48 hours, I brought her into my home, into a world she had never imagined, and one that had never imagined her. The car ride was quiet. She sat beside me in the back seat of my town car, eyes wide, fingers curled around her stuffed bear like it was a lifeline. She didn't ask questions. She didn't look excited. She just watched the buildings pass like someone seeing another planet for the first time. When we pulled up to my high-rise, she didn't flinch. She didn't marvel at the luxury. She just stepped out with a calmness that felt earned. Trauma has a way of dulling awe. My apartment wasn't ready for her, not emotionally, not practically. The guest room was pristine but sterile, full of unused furniture and expensive linens that had never held the weight of another body. I had groceries delivered, everything from cereal to fresh fruit to juice boxes and soft blankets. My assistant handled the logistics, booking appointments with pediatricians and therapists and lawyers. The housekeeper brought in small lamps, cozy rugs, anything to soften the sharp edges of a home that had only ever been mine. She didn't say much those first few days. She explored quietly, never straying far from the corner of the room. She didn't cry, didn't complain, didn't ask for anything. But every night, as I tucked her in, unsure if I was doing it right, she would look up at me and ask, "You won't send me back, right?" I told her no, every time. And every time, I meant it more than the last. But the rest of my world didn't understand. The moment my leadership team found out, which didn't take long, everything fractured. My chief legal officer called me into a closed-door meeting and opened with the words, "Do you realize what you've done?" They saw her not as a child, but as a liability. An unpredictable, undocumented, potentially dangerous risk. The PR fallout alone, they warned, could take years to repair. They feared rumors of a publicity stunt of child exploitation, of unstable behavior from someone at the helm of a billion-dollar company. My general counsel advised me to issue a statement distancing myself. My communications director suggested a quiet transfer of custody to a proper foster agency. I told them no. They didn't like that. The next board meeting turned hostile fast. Normally, they revered me, the woman who had saved the company from collapse, the strategist who always delivered. But now, I was something else, something unpredictable, a rogue variable they hadn't accounted for. The chairman of the board, a man I had mentored years ago, looked me straight in the eye and said, "You've jeopardized everything we've built." I said nothing, because for the first time, I didn't care. Back at home, she was slowly becoming part of the space. She started to hum when she brushed her teeth. She left socks in the hallway. She scribbled on napkins and taped them to the fridge. One morning, I caught her dancing a soft, silly sway in the middle of the living room when she thought I wasn't looking. It was the first time I saw her smile without fear behind it. I began adjusting, too. I stopped checking my phone during breakfast. I scheduled meetings for later in the day so I could be the one to walk her to school. I started learning what she liked: strawberry, yogurt, crayons, stories about dragons. She was still quiet, still guarded, but I could see her settling into the idea that maybe, just maybe, she was allowed to exist in a space that wouldn't hurt her. But that peace didn't last. The media got wind of it, first a whisper from an anonymous leak, most likely from inside my own executive circle. It started as a small blog post, then a local outlet picked it up. By the end of the week, it was everywhere. CEO's secret child, PR stunt, or emotional breakdown. The headlines were brutal, the photos invasive. They pulled images from the charity gala, circled her small figure in red, called her the mystery girl, and questioned my motives. Analysts speculated about instability in leadership. Investors got nervous. My company's stock dipped for the first time in months. I tried to shield her from it, but even at her age, she knew something had shifted. She started asking if I was angry, if I regretted taking her in, if she had done something wrong. It broke something in me. I reassured her as best I could, held her longer at night, told her it wasn't her fault, but I could feel the pressure building, not from her, never from her, but from the world that couldn't understand why someone like me would choose someone like her. They wanted to believe it was strategy. They couldn't accept that it was love. I sat in my office late one night, the skyline glittering through the glass, thinking about all the years I'd spent building this life. Every hour, every sacrifice, every relationship I'd severed to stay focused. I had built this empire to protect myself from ever needing anyone again. And now, for the first time in forever, I needed her. I didn't care about the headlines. I didn't care about the backlash. I didn't care if they fired me, because when I looked at her, truly looked at her, I saw something no amount of profit or praise had ever given me. I saw meaning. And then the media found out, and everything spiraled. They called me a kidnapper, a fraud, a manipulator. Within 48 hours of the media discovering she was living with me, the narrative, twisted into something monstrous, no longer a protected child in need. She became fodder for speculation, and I became the villain in the public's imagination. Overnight, I went from celebrated CEO to wanted criminal in the court of public opinion. Tabloids splashed my image next to words like kidnapper, fraud, manipulator. Social media spun theories. Did I abduct her for optics? Was I attempting to boost my PR profile? Did I stage that charity event entirely as a cover? The historian in me recoiled. The CEO in me recognized the damage. Everything I had built teetered beneath the weight of twisted words and edited video clips. It started with one local news channel airing grainy footage from the gala. My face, then hers, then a freeze frame with flashing text raises the question, what's her story? 4. It cast me in a sinister light as though I had orchestrated the moment, fed her the question, trained her to pluck at the heartstrings. Viewers rushed to comment. Hashtags multiplied like wildfire. Number CEO kidnapping, number corporate child. The optics became impossible to manage. The footage spun further from its original innocence with every replay, every journalist adding layers of speculation, every pundit labeling me a master manipulator, using a child to mask ambition with emotion. And the legal machinery began to rumble in the background, CPS, media, and legal watchdogs all demanding answers. Where did she come from? Who are her guardians? People demanded. Papers were filed. Inquiries issued. Nobody bothered to ask if she was safe. Instead, everyone questioned whether I would return her to someone who actually cared, or if I had simply scooped up a child in the name of optics. I started getting calls from board members. "Are you prepared for a custody investigation?" one asked sharply. "This could be disastrous." Another threatened, citing potential criminal charges and severe regulatory consequences. Less concerned was the child's welfare. More, the damage to the company stock prices began to tumble as fear and doubt spread through investors like gas. But through it all, she retreated. At first, tiny changes. She stopped drawing in the mornings, stared out the window instead of greeting me with her quiet dance, left the water running in the tub until I reminded her it would boil over. I asked her if she was okay. She barely whispered, "I'm fine." But she wasn't. Her eyes, once surprisingly trusting, now flickered when people mentioned press. She chewed her lip when a reporter's name came up in conversation. She stopped smiling completely. One evening, I came home early to pack a lunch for her. I found her curled in a corner of her room with the lights off. Photos of cityscapes and her scribbled pictures were still taped to the wall, but her expression was empty. I sat beside her, draped a blanket around her shoulders, and said simply, "I'm here." She looked up at me, tears glistening, and the words broke me. She said nothing for a while, just sat against me like she had a mountain to keep inside. She later said, "Everyone says I'm your stunt." She looked older than her years, the lines around her stare etched deeper today. I didn't know how to explain it to her beyond, "They're wrong." But even I wasn't sure whose side the law was on, or if I was still in a position to keep her safe. Late nights became unbearable. My office in my apartment became a war room, requests for documentation, threatened lawsuits, media appearances, interviews to correct the narrative. My legal team crafted statement after statement and relief packages that were undermined before they could be released, and I watched as incredulous opinions turned nastier. Was I mentally unstable? Was I emotionally impaired? Was I unfit to lead or even love? She didn't understand it. How could I explain that the world was turned upside down by speculation and ratings? She just sensed the tension and pulled tighter into herself. I saw her withdraw further the day I walked into the kitchen to find her standing in front of her favorite glass front fridge, staring at lunch ingredients like she had no appetite for hope. I asked if she wanted the sandwich I had prepared. She didn't respond. She just looked at me with eyes that had seen too much, and then she said it. "You're just like the rest of them." Her words echoed through me like warning bells and shattered my heart in two. She looked me dead in the eyes and whispered, "You're just like the rest of them." I'd spent my life preparing for failure, but not this kind. I'd spent my life preparing for professional failure, loss of clients, corporate collapse, financial ruin, but nothing had readied me for losing her. When she ran away, it felt like the floor had dropped out. I returned from a frenetic board meeting to discover she'd slipped out of the apartment under cover of darkness, her small silhouette gone along with the remaining fragments of normalcy I had managed to build around us. Panic didn't just grip me, it shattered me. I collapsed into the chair by the front door, phone in hand, unable to call anyone because I couldn't bear to admit to needing help the way a mother would. My carefully cultivated image cracked in that silence, and I felt every partner, every ally in the business world slide further away. I watched colleagues grow distant, their whispers behind my back sharper than any public headline could be. I abandoned everything and poured onto the streets, retracing the path I thought she'd take. Rain coated the pavement like tears, seeping into the soles of my shoes, cold and unwelcome. The city lights blurred into halos, and I whispered her name on every corner, as though the air itself might carry my voice to her. I showed her sketch, the image of her curled curls and torn dress, to maids and cab drivers, to shopkeepers flicking through, closing doors, to people who usually crossed the street to avoid me. Every stranger's gaze felt like judgment or pity or both, but none of them had seen her. Hours passed and dread coiled tighter in my chest. I sank to the curb by a dimly lit playground, hands trembling, thinking maybe I was lost in my fear when a homeless teenager approached. She was tall and bruised, heart lined with stories only the streets could tell. She glanced at the sketch, recognition flickering in her eyes for one flash enough to change everything. "I know her," she said quietly. "She helps me sometimes. Shares her lunch when no one's watching." Relief bloomed and threatened to choke me. "Where did you last see her?" I managed. "By the alley behind the old shelter, where the neon sign flickers," she said, her words gentle, heavy with knowing. "I think she went back to help the boy she was with." I thanked her, handing over wads of cash I hadn't realized were in my palm, and ran again through deserted streets, past puddles, reflecting orange street lamps, through alleyways slick with the stench of neglect. Rain blurred my vision, and adrenaline pushed me forward, focus narrowing to the memory of her steps, her scent, the curve of her shoulder when she held the toddler's hand. Then I saw it, a small shoe, its laces undone, lying against a brick wall. The vibrant yellow of the raincoat I'd found her in was smeared across the pavement. And there, near it, a dark blot that wasn't rain, red and deep. My breath went brittle. I knelt, careful not to think, only to act, fingers trembling as I braced myself on the wet concrete. The shoe looked like it had rolled out of reach, and the red stain glowed under the street lamp, raw and urgent. My pulse thundered. How had this gone this far? How had my world building, my controlled perfection, failed her? She didn't deserve fear, or danger, or this. Steps echoed behind me. I turned and glimpsed her small, wan, and collapsed against the raw curb. Her face was pale, her eyes fluttering, as if she was half dreaming between pain and sleep. The toddler slumped in her arms, eyes closed. My throat closed around the scream I couldn't let out. She was alive, barely, but alive. The rain washed over us both, cold and cleansing, turning my perfect life into chaos. The city pulsed around us, indifferent and bright, and yet this moment was fiercer than any boardroom teardown or merger defeat. I knelt beside her, gathered her into my arms despite the blood, despite the fear. I pressed my cheek to her spine, feeling the storm of her heartbeat beneath my palm. I mouthed words I didn't know how to say. I understood, in that moment, what loss meant, not the loss of empire or reputation, but the loss of her. I leaned back to see her face, her eyes unfocused, and I felt something break free in me. It was guilt, overwhelm, love all tangled into sharp clarity. And then came surrender. Because some failures don't announce themselves in press releases. They come in wet bricks of terror, in the shiver of a child you thought you saved but nearly lost. Because even at my most powerful, most composed, I realized here, bleeding on the sidewalk with her in my arms, that losing her would cost far more than losing everything else I'd ever built. And right behind that shoe, I saw her unconscious and barely breathing. In that hospital room, I realized I wasn't saving her, she was saving me. I roamed the sterile corridors of the hospital late into the night, the antiseptic smell sharp in my nostrils, mixing with the faint hum of machines and the soft, measured footsteps of nurses who treated pain with quiet professionalism. I arrived just after the surgeons closed the door, following them into a room where the air was thick with relief, exhaustion, and the scent of antiseptic. She lay in a hospital bed, tubes running from her arm like strange vines, monitors beeping like distant echoes of a storm, subsiding. She was alive, fragile and raw, but alive, and in that moment I realized that while I thought I was saving her, she was doing something far more profound. She was saving me. I stood at her bedside for hours, watching the rise and fall of her chest as though it held the meaning of everything I had lost in myself. I thought back to all the masks I had worn: ambitious CEO, detached leader, impervious boardroom force, and how hollow they had grown without purpose. Here, in the half-light of that hospital room, she was breathing life into me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Something cracked open inside me, not with relief or pride, but with the simple realization that I had allowed my heart to refuse its own humanity for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to care without strategy. When the night nurse delivered her a sheet of paper and something to eat, I fetched it without thinking. Back on the couch in the corner of the room, I found myself unfolding a crumpled drawing the girl had made on that paper. 2 figures holding hands, a crooked sun above them, and at the bottom, in uneven letters, "Do you still want to be my mom?" The line struck me like a tidal wave. I closed my eyes and leaned my head against the wall, letting the words sink into my chest like a secret I'd longed to hear but had been too afraid to admit I needed to. I reached out and gently placed my hand over hers. Once, as a child, I had asked for that gesture and been met only with silence. That night, under fluorescent lights and the hum of medical equipment, she looked at me, not just the girl who had asked once, but something braver, something transformed. My voice cracked when I spoke. "Yes, I do. More than anything." She didn't look surprised. She didn't smile. She simply squeezed my hand, her fingers faint but determined, like lifelines tethering me to something bigger than I had allowed myself to believe in. I stayed by her side through the night, sharing fragments of my childhood in the dark, memories of cold dinners, lectures about success, the unspoken mandate to never need anyone or be seen struggling. I spoke softly, haltingly, as though my confession was fragile glass. I told her how I built walls around me, a fortress made of ambition and distance, but how I had come to believe that someone in her gave me permission to tear one brick down. I didn't hide my fears. I told her how terrifying it was to care so deeply after all those years of numbness. She didn't fall asleep. She listened, eyes fixed on me, the rise and fall of her breath minuter by the minute, like the hush after a revelation. We didn't need fancy words or reassurances. In the silence that settled between us, a silent promise took shape, that neither of us would run from being seen again. When she whispered the question again, so small, so full of fragile hope I hardly dared to breathe, "Do you still want to be my mom?" My response was a tremor of emotion I could no longer keep in check. I leaned over and laid my forehead gently against hers, letting our breaths mingle, and whispered, "Always." Just then, the door opened behind me, soft at first, polite. 2 social workers entered, their steps measured, professional, and as they walked forward, my heart clenched. One held a folder, its pages starkly white and edged in authority. The other carried the weight of procedure. "Hello," one said gently, her time-worn voice cutting through the stillness between us like a warning bell. Before I could answer, before I could create a space to explain, justify, or fight, it all paused, suspended just as her question and my answer had lingered in the air. Then Child Services walked in with papers in hand. Before I could answer, Child Services walked in with papers in hand. I'd faced hostile takeovers, but never a system built to separate hearts. Stepping into the courtroom felt like walking onto a stage where judges and lawyers carried gavels and titles, not warmth or mercy. I had handled hostile takeovers in business with sharper resolve than I did when I had to stand in front of a judge and explain why I deserved to keep the girl who had saved me. The sterile scent of aged wood and leather-bound files pressed against my throat as social workers laid out their case. I was a wealthy CEO with no parenting track record, accused of making an unstable choice by bringing this child into my life. Not a nurturing, protective decision in a moment of fear, but a reckless, dangerous power play. Then the bedridden woman entered the courtroom, brought in on a wheelchair and looking far weaker than I had ever seen her in that apartment we passed once upon a time. Now, hospital frail. She sat across from me, eyes flickering with memory and longing, hands clenched tightly on her lap, as though she were holding herself together as much as the system now demanded. She raised her voice, trembling, insisting she was her guardian, that she had some claim, some right to reclaim whatever normalized detection I'd interrupted with my actions. It hurt in a way no hostile boardroom ever had, to hear her say she'd been wiped aside from my publicity, that the girl didn't belong with the person she thought might give her the most stability. When it was my turn to speak, I tried to wear armor of composure, but as my voice joined the chorus of respectful formalities, it cracked. I shared not as a lawyer or a professional, but as a flawed human, the story of my own childhood memory. How silence and absence had taught me that success was safer than affection. I spoke of why I'd stepped in. Because pressing matters had met a child whose hope was more authentic than any quarterly report. My words, spoken in a voice I barely recognized, conveyed more fear than confidence. I broke down in front of everyone, tears slipping silently down my cheek, my hands shaking against the evidence I had prepared. I wasn't polished. I didn't have bullet points or shareholder comparisons, just raw truth, emotional bankruptcy offered in place of a case, and it felt terrifyingly real. Then the courtroom hushed, because she stood up, walked unassisted, and handed a handwritten letter to the bailiff. When it reached me, the envelope trembled in my grip, and when I opened it, I discovered carefully scrawled words from her, a letter not intended for judges or lawyers, but for me. In precise handwriting, she wrote, "I choose her because she chose me back." The letter was simple, sacred. The room held a breath, mine included, because the judge paused, and in that silence, something shifted. The bailiff cleared her throat and placed the letter in front of the judge, who lifted her head slowly, paper delicately folded in her hands, expression inscrutable, every second stretched. The judge read it in silence, then slowly folded it and looked right at me. Winning custody didn't mean I knew how to be a mother. Even when the courtroom finally granted me temporary custody under probation, the victory never felt like one. Legal papers signed, guardian id submitted, criminal checks past it, all enabled me to care for her, but not in the way that really mattered. I had a stack of documents affirming my claim over her fate, but not a single one told me how to hold her when she cried, how to answer, "Mom?" when she said it in her sleep, or how to stay calm when she clung to me saying, "You won't send me back, right?" Because for all the legal weight behind the custody order, I remained uncertain was I a guardian or something more. The paperwork made me official, but it didn't make me a mother. I began to reshape my life around her needs. Board meetings were rescheduled, investor dinners postponed, and travel minimized. My calendar filled not with profits and projections, but with kindergarten drop-offs, dentist appointments, and bedtime stories. I learned to judge time differently. The minute between finishing my presentation and tucking her into bed became more meaningful than any shareholder call. I swapped spreadsheets for bedtime tales about faraway forests and brave princesses. I swapped dinners with powerful CEOs for coloring sessions on the living room floor. I let go of my finely tailored suits in favor of running shoes and casual hoodies so I could chase her on the playground or catch her when she tripped over her untied lace. And then something unexpected happened. We began to laugh. Real laughter that wasn't part of a corporate ad. One afternoon, over a school project building a cardboard castle, we worked side by side, turning scraps of paper into turrets and towers. She let me help glue pieces, tore impatiently at misaligned tabs, and even laughed when glue oozed onto her fingers. She said, unprompted, "You're fun." And I realized that in the tension between custody conditions and political optics, I had forgotten how to just be in the moment, how to be silly or imperfect or absurd. That kind of significance wasn't on any legal form, but it felt infinite. Despite that, self-doubt clawed at me every night. I whispered to myself that I was repeating the mistakes of my mother, giving love only when someone earned it, remaining emotionally distant in moments when she needed warmth most. In the dark, I worried I was too fragile, too impatient, too human for what this could require. I thought of how I grew up not knowing love without conditions, and feared I might raise her the same way, worshipped for success, not for who she was. Each time I tucked her in and kissed her forehead, part of me braced for the moment she might hate me, tell me it wasn't enough, or worse, say, "You're not real enough." I held that fear close, but she didn't know it. And then one evening, I found something on my pillow when I came downstairs to prepare coffee. A small envelope, handwritten in her inky script. My heart thumped so loudly I heard it over the quiet hum of the house. Inside was a note, scrawled in pencil and folded so many times it felt worn. "I like it here. Thank you for choosing me." My breath caught. I pressed the note against my chest, trying to cradle the weight of its meaning without crushing it. She saw me teary-eyed and just shrugged, shy. "You read it?" And I nodded, heart breaking gracefully and finally, fully, with the realization that love doesn't need perfection, only presence. I folded the note and tucked it into my pocket, trembling, but certain for the first time that I didn't want her back into my life as a project or headline. I wanted her with me as my child, in every messy, miraculous way. Then I returned to my desk, turned my monitor on, and found an email from a court clerk waiting in my inbox. "Final petition for full guardianship ready for your signature." Everything I had feared, planned for, and never expected to feel was encapsulated in that one sentence. That fear became real when a letter from her arrived. Hook. To move forward, I had to face the one woman I swore I'd never forgive. The moment the call came, I was in the midst of sorting through summer camp applications, textbooks, and suitcases, tokens of a life that once felt sterile and empty, now filled with color and chaos I had never allowed myself to welcome before. My hands froze over the forms when I heard her voice, low and shaky, on the other end of the line. My mother, after 20 years of absence, said she wanted to meet my daughter. She said she understood now. The words echoed through me like ghosts, stirring shadows I had believed were buried. To move forward, I had to face that woman, the one who saw success as sacrifice of softness, who taught me that love must be earned, not given. I had sworn I'd never forgive her, because I thought forgiveness meant weakness. Now, forgiveness felt like the only way to truly move forward. I stood by the window of my cluttered office, the late afternoon sun splintering across stacks of picture books and coloring pencils, and let her words sink in. She wanted to meet my daughter. Understand what? My explanation of love? Of choice? Of learning how to feel without fear? When I asked what she meant, her voice cracked. "I don't know how to ask for a second chance empty of expectations," she said, "but I want her to know why I wasn't there. I want her to understand." And that was all the invitation I needed to feel the ache in my chest crack open again, raw and uncertain. A week later, I arranged for them to meet in my living room. My daughter, this small being I had protected, shaped, and learned to love without measure, sat curled on the couch with a coloring book sprawled across her lap. The air was thick with unsaid apologies and forced calm as my mother walked in. She looked older than I remembered, her hair streaked with salt and grief, her shoulders slumping under weight invisible to everyone but me. She said nothing until she knelt in front of my daughter and held out a trembling hand wrapped in a red knit scarf from my childhood. "I was a fool," she said softly. "I thought ambition was love. I want to learn the difference." The room held its breath as my daughter looked from the scarf to the woman and then at me, curiosity shining in her eyes like lamps finally lit. She said something unexpected. "So that's where you got the sad eyes." Her words landed with a clarity I'd never had from adults, insight stripped of judgment, only recognition. The acknowledgement that I carried something old and longing within me, something she could see, gave my mother and me a doorway neither of us knew we needed. I hadn't expected tears, but there we were, breaking into each other's arms. My mother hugged me, and for the first time in decades, it felt real. Not fragile or conditional, but solid and whole. No words could fill the decades between us. But that moment, simple, unguarded, began stitching our story from the edges inward. But something inside me constricted, then a small voice that said this closure was too quick, too bright, and that forgiveness shouldn't just feel like relief, but should also be hard-earned. I pulled back gently and asked her to stay for dinner. My daughter laughed and ran off to hand her drawings to the woman who should have always been there to trace their lines. I watched them together. Strangers rebuilding with crayons and awkward apologies, and realized that healing, fragile and unpredictable, had begun. I knew I had to protect this fragile progress, even if a part of me wanted to pull back into my fortress of control. I wanted to ask my mother to stay long enough to earn trust, to listen, to carry something she hadn't carried before, love without expectation. But I didn't know how. As my mother helped my daughter place her drawings on the wall, I noticed a single tear rolling down her cheek. Not sad, not regretful, but soft. Acceptance, maybe. And that soft tear stayed between us, unspoken and full of meaning. Before I could reach for her hand again, the front door clicked. And for the first time, my mother hugged me like she meant it. The day she took my name, I finally felt like I had one too. 1 year had passed since I first held her close enough to feel her heartbeat against mine in that cold alley. And in that time, something remarkable happened. I became someone I never thought I could be. The adoption papers had finally arrived, stapled with legal authority, and after months of waiting, hearings, and emotional upheaval, they confirmed what had felt true long ago. She was mine. Reading the decree under the soft glow of my bedside lamp, I felt a clarity I had never known. This was the only ownership that mattered, and in that moment, as I held the official confirmation in trembling hands, I realized that when she took my name, I finally felt like I had one too. The changes that followed were subtle yet transformative. She was thriving. At school, she whispered questions about letters and summer projects, blending into laughter with classmates who knew her only through playground games. She had friends now, something I once thought would take years to build, and she came home each evening with stories bubbling off her tongue, stories I used to live for when they came in boardroom breakthroughs. But now, they were sweeter because they were hers, and I was healing, not just the jagged cracks inside me I'd been too proud to admit existed, but deep-rooted fractures that no deal had ever repaired. I found myself humming in the mornings, drawn by hope, not duty. When the press noticed an invitation arrived for me to speak at a conference on family, resilience, and purpose, I almost declined. But she tugged at my hand and said, "They might ask about me. Tell them our story." So I accepted. On the day of the event, the stage lights burned bright, and the auditorium glowed with expectant faces. My heart pounded not with imposter syndrome, but with love. After I spoke, someone from the audience shouted a question. "When she asked you to be her mom, what did you say?" I closed my eyes for just a moment, remembering her quiet voice asking, "Do you still want to be my mom?" The memory was so vivid I could feel the softness of her hand in mine. Even now, opening my eyes, I smiled, and then the microphone was handed to her. She stood for a heartbeat, careful, composed, fearless. When the spotlight landed on her, she looked out at the crowd with bright eyes and answered, not with hesitation, but with clarity and warmth. She said yes, but not just to me, to who she really islanded. The room felt still, as though her words rewrote the story of what love could be. I stepped forward and pulled her into my arms, and that was the moment all the pieces fell together. Identity, love, transformation, so many abstract words became real in that embrace. I had spent years constructing an empire, stringing together achievements, but none of it held the meaning of that hug. They say healing happens in stages: acknowledgement, acceptance, and then integration. I had grown into myself alongside her, and now we were woven together with intention, chosen by fate and affirmed by law. And because there was no longer a need for defensive walls, I finally felt free to collapse them. We left the stage together, hand in hand, and she chattered about crayons and her favorite ice cream flavor, and I realized I had a future filled not just with escalators and mergers but with bedtime stories, scraped knees, and unexpected laughter. My identity had shifted from CEO to mother, and in that shift, I found more power than I ever held in any boardroom. Because love, real love, isn't about dominance or control. It's about choosing every day to say yes to someone's true self. One question changed everything. If her bravery touched your heart, drop a comment below. I want to hear what it made you feel. Tap like if you believe one yes can change someone's entire world. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded. Sometimes, love from a stranger saves us. And if you want more stories where love wins in the end, don't forget to follow this page.